Former Labor Secretary Robert Reich, professor of public policy at Berkeley and the author of Saving Capitalism for the Many, Not the Few. Jeff, let me start off with you. As a Trump supporter, the nonpartisan Office of Government Ethics said yesterday about the Trump plan, he called it meaningless from a conflict of interest perspective. He said it, quote, doesn't meet the standards that the best of his nominees are meeting and that every president in the past 4 decades has met, and that, quote, the only thing it has in common with a blind trust is the label trust.
Yeah, first of all, this is an unusual situation. I mean, he's got this global empire all over the world that bears his name. You can't say to a family, okay, you've got to get out of the business while your father goes and is president. I mean, they're not working in the government. They work. This is what they do. So to somehow suggest that the sons get out of the business, I think, is unrealistic. And again, this is like the release of the taxes. Now, I grant you politically that any time there's a move, there's going to be a political story about this. I understand that. I'm sure they understand that. But, you know, again, I look back to the Kennedy administration. They had all these vast interests. The Merchandise Mart in Chicago, for one, they never gave it up until 1998. And went all the way through JFK's presidency. Nobody said a thing about it. Nobody cared. The former president was Sergeant Shriver. He went into the administration. The whole thing was held by the family. So I just think that you've got to understand this is the way this is going to work, and we're going to have to cope with it.
Secretary Reich, I mean, about the point that the president-elect made yesterday, that he has, in his words, a no-conflict situation because he's president. He could, if he said, if he wanted to, be president and run the Trump organization at the same time. Is he going above and beyond what's legally necessary here?
Anderson, first of all, you know, lawyers differ in terms of their interpretation of what the law requires. But somebody who's going to be president of the United States in 8 days, you would think would go out of his way to build public trust and build public confidence, particularly when he has an empire that is a 500 different companies across dozens of countries where issues have been raised about his closeness to Vladimir Putin, where there are questions raised about his taxes and about his debt and who he owes debt to and under what circumstances. You would think that somebody who's going to be president would cross every T and dot every I, but instead Donald Trump is doing exactly the opposite. He's saying, don't worry about it. I'm not worried about it. The public isn't worried about it. I don't have to give you my taxes. I don't have to establish a blind trust. I don't have to put an independent trustee. And this is total disdain for the democratic institutions of government. It's total disdain for public trust. And it's going to end up costing Donald Trump a great deal, because you can bet that there are going to be scandals and ethical problems all over the place, because the federal government regulates and provides and distributes money to so many businesses that Donald Trump is involved with, and his sons and family are involved with. Anderson, the idea that he's not going to talk to his sons and the sons are not going to talk to him about business is clearly and patently absurd.
But legally, Mr. Secretary, isn't he doing more than he has to?
No, as I said, you know, lawyers have interpreted these laws governing conflicts of interest very differently. I would say that he is not doing nearly what he should do, and that is also the conclusion of the independent ethics officer in the Office of Ethics in the United States government, who is independent, who is nonpartisan, who is supposed to be looking at these things objectively. He is saying exactly what I am saying. Many people out there in the public are saying, what does he have to hide? Why isn't he even providing his taxes? You know, for 4 decades, presidents have been doing this, establishing blind trusts, and for even longer that, providing their taxes. I mean, when Ben Carson, who is the nominee, Trump's nominee for HUD, today, in his confirmation hearing, he was asked by Elizabeth Warren, can you promise us that you are not going to distribute any of your $32 billion of HUD money in ways that benefit Donald Trump? And what is Ben Carson going to do? He said, essentially, he could not make that promise. Why could he not make that promise? Because there is no blind trust. There is no institutional way for any cabinet member to be absolutely assured that he's not going to do this.
Number one, we just had the election. This has been litigated. All these things were out there for the American public to see. They could have rejected Donald Trump. They did not reject Donald Trump based on these arguments. So, I mean, that's been decided by the American people. It's over. But secondly, I will say that we have a bit of a problem here with folks in the quote-unquote political class saying that people who have all these business interests have all potential conflicts of interest. Well, what about conflicts of interest for people in the political class? What happens if you are, like many suggest with Senator Cory Booker, that he's using his position in the United States Senate to run for president? Is that a conflict of interest? I mean, we don't examine these things in a political context because all the focus is political people focusing on business. And
you know, this is an absolutely crazy set of arguments. I mean, first of all, we're trying to clean up government.
Thank you.
You know, no, let me just say this. I mean, Donald Trump came into government saying that he was going to drain the swamp. One of the reasons he was elected is because so many people are so concerned about all this money in politics, all this money in Washington. That was the whole, this anti-establishment fervor that said effectively, we don't want the status quo, we don't want politics as usual, we don't want big money in politics. That was what he was elected for. He's turning around. This is another kind of 180-degree turn, a 360-degree turn on behalf of Donald Trump.
Talking about draining the swamp has to do with Washington, D.C. and the culture of Washington, D.C., the culture of lobbyists, the culture of consultants, the consultant class, etc.
And the culture, a big part of the culture of Washington has been conflicts of interest that are skating the letter of the law. Maybe they observe the letter of the law, but they are not observing the spirit of law. There are ethical problems. I mean, Donald Trump is creating an ethically challenged administration before he even begins, 8 days before. And one other thing. I was amazed at that press conference yesterday. Donald Trump says, oh, well, the public doesn't care. How does he know the public doesn't care?
Because he's president-elect of the United States. That's how he knows.
Well, wait a minute. Just because you're elected president of the United States doesn't mean the public is, you know, a lot of people held their noses and voted for Donald Trump. It doesn't mean that he has legitimacy. It doesn't mean that he can simply say to and regard all of the institutions of democracy as his playthings from now on. I mean, that being president doesn't give you a license to undermine the integrity of our government.
Secretary Reich, I understand that you and your colleagues on your side of the line are going to be making this argument
is not about one side or the other.
For 4 years or 8 years. I understand that's what's going to happen, and I think Donald Trump understands that. But the American people made their decision. It's over. Get on with it.
What are you talking about? And nothing is over. I mean, he could be impeached, in a year from now.
But Jeff, I mean, you made the point, well, you can't tell his sons not to be in business.
Right.
I mean, the question is, should Donald Trump still have an ownership of the business? He could have handed it all over to the sons and, you know, completely stepped out of it, not just in the running of it, but actually in any ownership.
I mean, are we going to say to any businessman who runs for office, you can't do this?
But there are rules for business. I mean,
We say.
Go ahead.
That's what we say. We say you've got to get out of your business. And there's something called Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, the Emoluments Clause, which says particularly if you're dealing with foreign governments, if your businesses, let me just finish, if your businesses are international, you have got to be especially careful not to get any cash from foreign governments, because then you are actually violating the Constitution
then,
of the United
Secretary,
States.
Then this should have been applied to Secretary Clinton, right? Because the Clinton Foundation is in essence a business.
Well, Secretary Clinton was not, number one, she was not president of the United States.
She was Secretary of State.
And they started to make, the Clintons started to make changes that I wish they had made long before in terms of their holdings. But she put her holdings into, everybody puts their holdings into a blind trust. I mean, when I was Secretary of Labor, I mean, I had to put all of my,
the foundation
they weren't Donald Trump holdings, but I had to put my holdings into a trust. So I would not make any decisions that affected in any way anything that I had invested in.
Right.
Do you understand how important this is?